they vanished without a trace. 115 men, women, and children. No bodies, no graves, just a single cryptic word carved into a tree. Croatoan. For centuries, the disappearance of the Roanoke Colony has haunted the American imagination. Its fate woven into the fabric of the nation's oldest, most chilling unsolved mystery. It was a phantom limb in the body of history, a ghost story whispered around campfires and debated in dusty academic halls. But now, in 2025, after generations of baffling silence, scientists have cracked the code, and what they've unearthed isn't just shocking, it's profoundly terrifying, forcing us to rewrite a hidden chapter of America's very beginning. This isn't just an old mystery solved, it's the untold American origin story, a parable of survival, silence, and the astonishing resilience of people lost to time. In the scorching summer of 1587, under the relentless glare of the Atlantic sun, 3 fragile English ships slipped through the treacherous shallows and anchored off Roanoke Island, an untamed spit of land nestled precariously along the jagged, wild coast of what is now North Carolina. Aboard those vessels were 115 men, women, and children, each stepping onto the soil of the New World not as hardened adventurers, but as desperate dreamers, carrying the fragile, burning hope of a new beginning. They were not the first to try. 2 earlier, ill-fated English attempts had already crumbled, marred by brutal violence, insufficient supplies, and crippling infighting. But this group, led by the affable yet pragmatic John White, was different. They had brought their families, a desperate gamble for permanence. And among them was a newborn symbol of that hope, Virginia Dare, John White's granddaughter and profoundly the first English child born on American soil. Her birth was celebrated not only as a familial joy, but as a monumental political statement, a defiant declaration that England could and would root itself here. The settlers worked tirelessly under a towering canopy of ancient pine and gnarled oak, erecting a modest wooden fort, painstakingly planting crops, and forging fragile, often uneasy, ties with local indigenous tribes. The land was wild, breathtakingly beautiful, and utterly unforgiving, but they endured, clinging to their hope with fierce determination. Then, almost as soon as they had arrived, White, their leader, was forced to return to England for more crucial supplies, a voyage he optimistically expected would take only a few short months. But across the vast, turbulent Atlantic, Europe was on fire. England was locked in a deadly existential standoff with Spain, and Queen Elizabeth I, desperate for ships, had conscripted every available vessel for the furious fight against the mighty Spanish Armada. White found himself stranded for 3 agonizingly long years, helplessly watching the calendar crawl by, his mind consumed by terrifying imaginings of what might be happening back across the ocean. When he finally desperately returned to Roanoke in August of 1590, the silence that greeted him was suffocating, thick with dread. The harbor was eerily calm, its waters undisturbed. The fort stood exactly as he had left it, palisades upright, gates unbroken, structures intact. But life was gone. Not a single soul stirred. No laughter, no children's footsteps, no smoke rising from hearths. The air was heavy, as though the island itself knew what horrors had transpired and stubbornly refused to speak. There were no signs of violence, no bloodstains, no scattered belongings, no freshly dug graves, no bones picked clean by the relentless march of time. The only trace of the settlers' fate was a single, cryptic word carved into wood, Croatoan, on the fort's entrance post, and the unfinished letters CRO on a nearby tree. White's heart pounded with a desperate mix of hope and terror. That word, Croatoan, was the name of a nearby island, home to a friendly indigenous tribe. It was the agreed-upon code, a secret token as he called it, a sign in case of emergency. Relocation. Crucially, there was no cross, no distress symbol, which implied they hadn't been in immediate danger. Perhaps he thought they had moved voluntarily. Perhaps they were safe, integrated into the tribe. But fate, cruel and unyielding, denied him the chance to know for certain. As White prepared to set sail for Croatoan Island, a violent, unforeseen storm descended upon his ship. Its anchor broke, supplies dwindled to dangerously low levels, crew morale collapsed, leaving him helpless. With a heavy, despairing heart, John White was forced to turn back for England, never to return again to the island he had so desperately sought to colonize. To this day, his journal remains one of the only first-hand accounts of that agonizing moment. His words tremble with profound confusion and restrained despair. It was not what he saw that truly terrified him. It was what he didn't do. And for that, an entire colony, a vibrant piece of England, transplanted to the New World, vanished without a single trace. For centuries, this became America's ultimate ghost story, buried in speculation and dead ends. In the centuries that followed, Roanoke's fate became a haunting puzzle no historian could definitively solve and no conspiracy theorist could possibly resist. As early as the 1600s, vague reports began to emerge from New English settlers further north in Jamestown. They spoke of strange encounters with indigenous tribes whose members sometimes spoke broken English, who claimed to descend from white ancestors. Some bore unnervingly light hair, gray eyes, and features uncommon among local native nations. There were rumors, too, of crude hand-drawn maps showing villages further inland with English-style structures, buildings laid out in straight lines as if guided by a Western hand, but nothing was ever concretely verified. Every tantalizing lead, every whispered clue seemed to dissipate into thin air, ending in frustrating ash. In time, more sinister theories arose, filling the gaping void of knowledge. Some believed the colonists had been brutally killed by nearby tribes after a breakdown in diplomacy. Others blamed brutal internal conflict, widespread starvation, or unimaginably harsh winters, driving them to unthinkable acts like cannibalism or madness. A few theorists pointed accusatory fingers at the Spanish, who were known to secretly patrol the Atlantic seaboard, ruthlessly eliminating rival European settlements in secret. Then came the chilling stories of curses, of sacred burial grounds disturbed, of the very land itself rejecting the foreign settlers like a body fighting a virulent infection. Despite the agonizing lack of concrete answers, excavations and studies persisted, driven by an insatiable curiosity. Archaeologists meticulously scoured the island and its surrounding regions. They unearthed tantalizing shards of pottery, rusted weapons, and trade beads, items that might have belonged to the colonists or might not. The line between myth and reality was paper thin, constantly blurring. In 1937, a dramatic new development surfaced: the infamous Dare stones, so called because the messages supposedly inscribed on the rocks were from Eleanor Dare, Virginia's mother. The first stone told a heartbreaking tale of disease, death, and Eleanor's profound grief, a narrative that captivated the entire nation. More stones, however, quickly followed. Too many. Eventually, skeptical scholars, armed with forensic analysis, labeled most, if not all, as elaborate fakes. Hope gave way once again to bitter disillusionment. Yet something about the Roanoke Colony's disappearance utterly refused to die. It haunted the American imagination, a blank canvas of just enough truth to inspire endless speculation and just enough absence to sustain legend. Centuries passed, technologies advanced, ambitious DNA studies were proposed, LiDAR scans and ground-penetrating radar meticulously combed the Carolinian coast, but the mystery remained defiantly unsolved. An entire community, a tangible piece of early English ambition, vanished into the woods, into the mists of history, leaving in their place only agonizing questions. Just when all hope seemed lost, a tiny detail on an old map, long overlooked, unlocked the first real secret. It began, as many great historical discoveries do, with something small, something seemingly insignificant. In 2012, a curious, meticulous researcher at the British Museum was carefully analyzing a fragile 16th century watercolor map titled La Virginia Pars, meticulously crafted by the English artist and explorer John White himself. The map, delicate and sun-faded, had long been an object of profound scholarly interest. But that day, something peculiar, almost imperceptible, caught the researcher's trained eye. An anomaly beneath a patch of paper, barely visible unless you knew precisely where and how to look. Using backlighting, an old, almost forgotten technique for detecting underdrawings and erasures, they saw it. The faint but unmistakable outline of a square-shaped fort meticulously etched beneath the surface, hidden beneath a patch near the confluence of the Roanoke and Chowan rivers. The symbol was drawn in invisible ink, or possibly an iron gall composition that had faded into near transparency over centuries. What made this discovery so extraordinary wasn't just the clandestine nature of the marking, it was its location. Exactly 50 miles west of Roanoke Island. That distance was not random. It corresponded chillingly with a cryptic note in John White's own journals, written just before he returned to England in 1587. In it, White recorded that the Roanoke colonists, the very people who would later vanish without a trace, had intended to move 50 mir into the Maine. That phrase, long dismissed or overshadowed by the more dramatic mystery of the word Croatoan carved into a tree, suddenly gained immense, undeniable weight. Why had White, the colony's governor, hidden this fort on his own map? Theories swirled among historians. Some believed he intended to protect the colony's location from Spanish spies who were actively scouring the Americas to undermine English settlements. Others wondered with a chilling sense of dread if White himself never returned because he feared what he might find: utter failure, devastating disease, or something far, far worse. The map, a seemingly benign artifact, had suddenly become a powerful cipher for the enduring mystery of America's first lost colony. The discovery electrified the archaeological world. Soon after the North Carolina-based First Colony Foundation, a dedicated group committed to solving the enigma of Roanoke, decided it was time to act. Under the direction of renowned archaeologist Nick Lachetti, they began an intensive investigation into this promising new location, an area along the Albemarle Sound in Bertie County, North Carolina. This tantalizing site was soon given an ominous yet hopeful new name: Site X. The dig at Site X began with immense anticipation, but not without a healthy dose of academic skepticism. The terrain itself, thick with impenetrable pine forest and tangled underbrush, bore little resemblance to the traditional image of a neat, orderly English fort. And as the painstaking excavation expanded, the team found no imposing palisade walls, no defensive trenches, no orderly barracks, nothing that immediately screamed fort. But then, just beyond the boundaries of an abandoned Native American village known as Metakem, the soil began to yield its quiet, astonishing secrets. Unearthed beneath centuries of sediment were unmistakable fragments of English pottery, distinctly dated to the late 1500s. These weren't ceremonial or trade items, easily dismissed as simple exchange. They were utilitarian bowls, storage jars, and cooking pots, many glazed in the characteristic greenish tint of Surrey, Hampshire ware, unmistakably imported from Elizabethan England. And one detail stood out more than any other: there were no clay pipes. This seemingly minor absence spoke profound volumes. The settlers of Jamestown, founded in 1607, were famously fond of clay tobacco pipes, which often littered their refuse pits, leaving clear archaeological markers. The Roanoke colonists, however, predated that trend. Their lack here wasn't an oversight, it was a precise, undeniable timestamp. This discovery marked something radical. The pottery didn't just suggest English presence, it powerfully hinted at sustained habitation. These weren't casual visitors or lost stragglers. Someone had lived here, cooked here, stored food, and settled, at least for a significant while. As interest in the region soared, the team deployed ground-penetrating radar to survey the surrounding dense area. That's when a second promising location came to light, just 2 miles away, a place they would later call Site Y. Again, the soil offered up quiet but powerful testimony. This time, the artifacts were broader in scope, fragments of European, ceramics from different regions, suggesting a mixing of cultural origins. This introduced a new, daring possibility, one that had rarely been considered in such detail before. A scenario of dispersal, a desperate and intelligent attempt to integrate, adapt, and endure in the harsh and unfamiliar terrain. A grim narrative began to take shape in the minds of researchers. It was not a tale of a single lost colony consumed by the wilderness, but of fragmentation. Some may have embedded themselves in local tribes like the Croatoan. Others may have ventured further inland to build makeshift settlements under the cover of secrecy, possibly under the protection of allies or sympathetic native leaders. Site X and Site Y, separated by a sliver of forest and 4 centuries of time, began whispering of a story lost to colonial records. A story not of failure, but of fragmentation, not of disappearance, but of profound transformation. And the deeper they dug, the more it seemed that Roanoke's disappearance wasn't a single cataclysmic moment in history, but a complex mosaic of desperate choices, quiet survival, and astonishing endurance. While Site X continued to dominate the headlines with its tantalizing clues and scholarly debates, a quieter but equally compelling excavation was unfolding over 200 miles to the southeast, on the windswept, salt-sprayed sands of Hatteras Island. Once known as Croatan, this island had always whispered legends of a different fate for the lost colonists, a story woven into the very fabric of local lore. And now, those whispers were being unearthed in the most literal way possible. At the center of this excavation was British archaeologist Mark Horton, working in tandem with the Croatan Archaeological Society, a dedicated local team led by island native Scott Dawson, whose family had lived there for generations. Unlike Site X, where artifacts hinted at a deliberate inland relocation, the Hatteras findings told a powerful, undeniable story of assimilation. Among the windswept dunes and beneath layers of shifting coastal soil, they unearthed unmistakable signs of continuous English presence: a rusted rapier hilt, corroded gun parts, and most remarkably, a slate writing tablet still bearing the faint scratches of English script. These weren't random relics cast aside by travelers. They were deliberate, human, purposeful, left behind by people who were clearly living on the island, not just passing through. Even more compelling was the island's vibrant oral tradition, passed down for generations among the Lumbee and other native communities. These stories, long dismissed by mainstream academia as mere myth or romanticism, defiantly claimed that white settlers had joined with the native Croatoan people, forming families, building lives, and adapting to their new home. Until now, those stories had remained just that, stories. But the artifacts, speaking a silent language of their own, told a tale that powerfully echoed those voices from the past, lending irrefutable credibility to what had long been marginalized as mere folklore. Scott Dawson's 2020 book, The Lost Colony in Hatteras Island, meticulously documented these findings in detail. His argument was provocative, audacious. The colony didn't vanish, it fractured. Some, perhaps a desperate few, may have gone inland towards Site X, but others, perhaps far more than previously imagined, integrated completely with the indigenous communities on Croatoan itself. They weren't lost, they were simply hiding in plain sight, camouflaged by history's neglect and their own desperate adaptation. This raised an even more daring, more comprehensive possibility. What if both stories, Site X and Hatteras, were true? What if the lost colony didn't collapse, but brilliantly, desperately evolved? To truly explore this revolutionary two-pronged theory, scientists knew they had to go beyond mere shovels and maps. This wasn't just archaeology anymore. It was forensic investigation spanning centuries, a high-tech detective hunt across time. And so began the next phase, deploying cutting-edge technology. Using ground-penetrating radar, teams were able to detect subterranean anomalies, hidden foundations, buried structures, without disturbing the fragile landscape. Then came LiDAR, a revolutionary technology that strips away dense vegetation, and digital scans to reveal ancient structures and subtle landscape changes long hidden by time. These tools revealed undeniable patterns: post holes, fence lines, old hearths that suggested long-term settlement activity in areas previously thought utterly empty. But the most chilling, most profound insights came from the artifacts themselves. Researchers painstakingly compared pottery shards, tools, and remnants from sites X, Y, and Hatteras, hoping to draw irrefutable connections or spot telltale inconsistencies. What they found flipped the timeline upside down. Unlike artifacts from later English settlements like Jamestown or Plymouth, where distinctive clay tobacco pipes, post-1600s ceramics, and specific European wares are common and easily identifiable, none of those chronological markers appeared at the Roanoke associated sites. Instead, the materials were perfectly consistent with a pre-1600 English presence, precisely when the Roanoke settlers would have disappeared. This meant one terrifying thing: these weren't just traces of later colonial movement, these were the Roanoke colonists themselves. Then came the bombshell: DNA analysis. Buried deep in the genetic code of local indigenous communities, scientists began to find distinct markers consistent with Western European ancestry dating back centuries. Crucially, this wasn't the result of later European mingling during subsequent waves of colonization. It was something far older, something that aligned suspiciously, perfectly with the timeline of 1587. And that's when the researchers, gripped by the enormity of their discovery, said it quietly at first, then with a rising tremor of profound realization: this was terrifying. If the implications were true, everything we thought we knew about early American history, Jamestown in 1607, Plymouth in 1620, the entire Mayflower mythology, might not be the beginning at all. The true first chapter may have been tragically, written by a group of colonists who had already been declared dead, lost to history. But they hadn't perished, they had lived, they had adapted, and then inexplicably they had vanished from memory, their stories buried by time and indifference. These profound breakthroughs, however, did not come without fierce debate. For every New truth unearthed in the red North Carolina soil. A fresh academic debate seemed to rise from it like smoke. The mystery of the lost colony wasn't just a historical enigma anymore. It had become an ideological battlefield, pitting new evidence against long-held beliefs. On one side were the believers, convinced the accumulating evidence told a coherent, compelling story of adaptation and survival. On the other were the skeptics, established scholars and scientists who viewed the findings not as revelations, but as frustrating riddles, incomplete pieces of a still unsolved puzzle. Dr. Charles Ewan, a veteran archaeologist and a prominent voice, was among the most vocal critics. He accused the researchers of confirmation bias, warning that the pursuit had become less about objective discovery and more about vindicating long-held theories. "They're trying to prove a theory," he famously said in a 2019 interview, his voice laced with concern. "Not disprove it. That's dangerous for science." Then there was Scott Dawson, the Croatoan native and historian whose family had lived on Hatteras Island for generations. To him, the answer had always been obvious, woven into the very fabric of his people's oral traditions. The colonists had integrated with the Croatoan tribe. There were oral histories, linguistic overlaps, and even genetic hints to confirm this. Theory: they went to Croatoan, he insisted with unwavering conviction, not deep inland into hostile territory. Site X, Dawson argued, was not only too far, over 50 miles from Roanoke Island, but it was also surrounded by groups the colonists had previously antagonized. It would have been suicide. Yet, within the First Colony Foundation itself, the very organization spearheading the search, consensus remained elusive. One camp passionately pushed the split colony theory, that the settlers divided, with some seeking refuge with friendly tribes along the coast and others venturing inland. Another camp dismissed the inland theory altogether, arguing that any European artifacts found there might have belonged to earlier exploratory missions, perhaps even a scouting party sent before the main 1587 group, not the lost colonists themselves. The artifacts, in their silent testimony, told a murkier story. A silver ring with a lion crest, a rapier hilt, unmistakably European fragments of pottery chemically linked to 16th century English kilns. Enough to tantalize, not enough to confirm. Absolutely. Still, as the years wore on, as the technology advanced, skepticism began to bend, slowly but surely. New technologies like ground-penetrating radar, drone-assisted mapping, and advanced DNA sequencing added fresh, undeniable tools to the archaeologist's toolkit. Radiocarbon dating got more precise, soil analysis became more granular, and year by year, artifact by artifact, the evidence kept accumulating, quietly, stubbornly, like whispers from the past refusing to be ignored, refusing to be silenced. And then, in 2025, the whispers turned into a roar. The dig site was unassuming, a quiet, nondescript patch of dry earth near the banks of the Chowan River, just miles from the elusive Site X. It was a cold February morning, and the First Colony Foundation team had little reason to expect anything groundbreaking. Their hopes tempered by years of painstaking effort and previous disappointments, until they found her. The burial was unmistakably Christian. The skeleton lay supine, head facing west, feet pointing east, the traditional orientation meant to face the rising sun on Resurrection Day. There were no grave goods, no elaborate markings, just the bones, weathered by time, but remarkably intact. A quiet dignity lingered in the way she had been laid to rest, but what changed everything was the DNA. Mitochondrial analysis conducted, with cutting-edge precision, revealed she was of irrefutable European descent and she was female. The implications hit the team like a thunderclap, a sudden, blinding flash of understanding. The all-male 1585 Roanoke expedition was immediately ruled out. The Jamestown settlers, they came years later and had no record of traveling this far. Inland, the chilling, undeniable conclusion, this woman didn't arrive with explorers. She had lived and died there, deeply embedded in the land, which meant others must have too. For centuries, the phrase "the lost colony" had conjured images of mass disappearance, of settlers swallowed whole by the wilderness in a single catastrophic blow. But now, with the profound discovery of this single silent grave, the entire narrative was being rewritten in real time. "This is terrifying," one archaeologist was heard whispering through tears, his voice choked with emotion. "Not just because we found her, but because now we know others were there too." The profound truth was undeniable. The settlers hadn't vanished. They hadn't been killed off in a single annihilating blow. They had moved. They had adapted. And against all odds, they had survived. By now, the breadcrumbs have taken us to two possible destinations and two very different fates, solidifying the split migration theory. The mounting archaeological and linguistic evidence now points to a fractured migration. It appears the colonists, once united under the impossible dream of building a New England in a harsh, unfamiliar world, fractured under immense, unimaginable pressure. Some, perhaps the most desperate or pragmatic among them, made their way southeast to Hatteras Island. There, among the Croatoan tribe, they may have found an uneasy sanctuary, a desperate haven. Traces of English-style tools, fragments of European pottery, and even genetic hints in the descendants of native families have all powerfully converged on this theory. The Croatoan, known for their relative openness, may have allowed the weary settlers to integrate, though not without profound cultural loss on both sides. This was not assimilation out of ambition. It was a quiet surrender to absolute necessity. Others, it seems, ventured inland, deeper toward the dense woodlands around Metakem, farther into the unforgiving wilderness. Perhaps they sought autonomy, a fresh start, or simply a place to vanish from the grasp of potential rescuers, but also crucially from the maps of history. Their decision, in all likelihood, was not guided by grand strategy or imperial ambition. It was driven by sheer, desperate survival. The colony had been ravaged by too many silent enemies, drought that turned their crops to dust, diseases that had no cure, and starvation that tested every moral boundary. Add to that the omnipresent fear of attack from rival native tribes or even Spanish forces, and perhaps the most fatal threat of all, internal fractures, disagreements, divisions, fear. After all, erodes unity faster than any enemy at the gates. When trust dissolved, so did the colony. So they did what desperate people always do when faced with the end. They ran, not as one cohesive unit, but in scattered, desperate threads. Some to the sea, some to the trees, and all disappeared, their story buried by time. The Lost Colony is more than a historical mystery. It's a profound parable written in vanishing ink about the very foundation of America. For centuries, we treated it like a historical hiccup, an unresolved curiosity buried deep in textbooks. But the story of Roanoke is something far more intimate, far more foundational. It's the American origin story most people have never truly heard, not because it lacks significance, but because the voices were quiet, silenced by time, by nature, by indifference. And yet, within this profound silence lies a story of breathtaking depth, of fear, yes, but also of astonishing resilience, of impossible courage, of people who risked everything to carve a future from untamed soil, and who, in their final desperate days, made impossible decisions with unimaginable consequences. This is a story about survival and the brutal price of it, about how cultures collided, then blurred, then merged, how fragile memory is in a world where no statues are raised, where no graves are marked, when the only monument is a single word. Croatoan, carved in the bones of a dying settlement. What makes this terrifying isn't that we didn't know the truth, it's that we almost didn't ask. Centuries passed while the bones of this mystery lay hidden in tree roots and riverbeds. But in 2025, science, with its relentless curiosity, whispered back. Genetic testing, ground-penetrating radar, linguistic reconstructions, all converging to reveal what ancient oral traditions had tried to preserve for generations. They weren't lost, not really, we just stopped listening. And what we nearly lost was more than a colony. It was our capacity to remember, our ability to care, to connect the faint vanished footprints to the desperate, courageous people who made them. Because if the first Americans to vanish could be erased this easily, who else have we forgotten? That is the true haunting legacy of Roanoke, not the disappearance itself, but the chilling ease with which history can let go. What if the colonists were never lost, just waiting to be found? What do you think about these new revelations? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We thank you for watching this video with us, and we'll catch you in the next one.